right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, The Fast and the Frivolous, The Race for Vulnerability Remediation. It's 12 on the dot, so I know some people are just joining, so I'm going to wait another minute to let people in before we get started. All right, so again, thank you everyone and welcome to our joint webinar. My name is Miriam Mayer. I'm the Senior Director of Product Marketing at SecurityScorecard, and I'm really excited to be here today with Wade Baker from Cyentia and Greg Petropoulos from our team here at SecurityScorecard to talk about the pace of vulnerability remediation and some of the joint research we just did together. Before we get started, I just want to go over some housekeeping items. This is a live webinar, so please ask your questions in the chat. We will be going through Q&A at the end, or maybe even sprinkle and answer some of them throughout the presentation. And the other thing is we will have some polls throughout the webinar. So these are anonymous and they're just some polls to get your feedback and make it interactive. So please make sure to participate in them. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded and we will follow up with the recording and some of the assets in the report that we'll be chatting about today. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started and introduce our speakers. So I'll get started with Wade Baker from the Cyentia Institute. Welcome.
Hey, everybody. Thank you.
And we also have Greg Petropoulos, who's our Director of Data Science here at SecurityScorecard.
Thank you very much, Miriam.
And before we even begin, let's just start with a bit of an overview of who the Cyentia Institute is, and then we'll hop over to scorecards. So Wade, going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, and hello, everybody. If you are not familiar with the Cyentia Institute, first of all, I know it's a weird name, so that's how we pronounce it, but we accept all pronunciations of that. Basically, it's Cyentia is the Latin word for science, and we've cyberized it with the CY, and that's what we do. We do cybersecurity research, and you see some of that research here. Specifically, the research that we show here is focused on vulnerability management, which is the topic of our conversation today. I love this topic because it's one of those that we've been doing in the security realm forever. But everybody knows it's hard and it's a struggle, and everyone I talk to has areas that they can improve the way they manage vulnerabilities. So whether that is vulnerabilities in code, in the development process, or in production systems, or like we'll talk about today, external internet-facing systems, there's a lot of things that the data has for us to help us to prioritize what should be remediated and how to go about that. So excited to talk with you about this and any other research we do at Cyentia.
Awesome. Thank you, Wade. And I didn't know that was the genesis of the name, but I love that story. So thank you for sharing that too. Now I'm going to hand it over to Greg to tell us a bit about SecurityScorecard.
Thank you, Miriam. So SecurityScorecard is the global leader in the cybersecurity rating space and the only service which rates millions of organizations continuously. Thousands of organizations leverage our patented ratings technology for self-monitoring, third-party risk management, board reporting, and cyber insurance underwriting in their 2022 plans. And our mission at SecurityScorecard is to enable every organization in the world to use our security scorecards to make the world a faster, smarter, safer place, and to help people make more strategic business decisions. And I just want to say it's been a pleasure to partner with Wade and Cyentia. I also didn't know that that's how you guys created your name, and I love it.
Yeah, the name stories are always fun. Awesome. Thank you both. So now that we've covered what we do, let's jump into our panel and the first question. And I always love to start with the title of the webinar because there's always a reason behind it and a reason that we're here discussing this topic today. So today's webinar is called The Fast and the Frivolous, And I just want to start with asking you both, you both are helping either Greg produce a lot of the data that went into this report and Wade then help analyze it and come up with these really interesting findings. So why is this report so significant?
I'll take a crack at that. First of all, the title is kind of fun, fun set of movies, obviously that we're playing on, but it actually is very relevant to the data that we see. When you look at organizations and the pace of remediation, there are some that are quite fast. They really stay on top of those vulnerabilities. And then there are others that are a little more frivolous, a little more haphazard, a little more not maybe taking the best, most efficient course of action to remediate vulnerabilities across their environment. And there's everyone in between as well. So anytime that we can study a large amount of data on a large set of organizations and how they're managing security issues, I'm all for it and enjoy that kind of research.
Awesome. And go ahead, Greg.
Oh, I was just going to say that, as SecurityScorecard, we do collect a large amount of data, both in breadth and depth. And this was a really interesting way to dig really, really deep into one specific area. And some of the findings sort of are very elusive to the title, or allude to the title. Very interesting the way that we noticed different organizations, in some cases not prioritizing high severity or known vulnerabilities, or known exploited vulnerabilities. And so there's just a ton of stuff that sort of fell out of this, and this is sort of one of the fun pieces of information we found.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to dig into that. And before we even go, Wade or Greg, if you all want to cover just a quick overview of some of the data, and I know we'll dig into it more, that went specifically into this report.
Yeah, so we produced data for Cyentia and Wade to look into. So we looked at over 1.6 million organizations. There was billions of exposed assets. We looked at a 3-year time period. So we were able to do some very sort of zoom back and look at behavior over long periods of time. And we were able to measure both the prevalence of vulnerabilities and the pace of which companies were remediating them.
Great. And that's a perfect segue to my next question, which is actually all about the data. And luckily we have Greg here, who is one of our data experts here at SecurityScorecard. So, Gregory, can you walk us a bit through how this data is being collected and where it comes from?
Sure thing. So if we look at sort of where our data comes from as sort of a layered sandwich, if you will. So if we start at the bottom, we start at the data collection layer. And so we've built a collection of sensors and software which continuously observe millions of security signals every day across the entire IPv4 space on the internet and across millions of domains. Our R&D team is continuously innovating on how to collect newer, deeper, more exciting signals and newer signals, because security is an evolving space, so new things come up all the time. Moving up a layer, all of our findings exist on either an IP address or a domain. And so we have a proprietary attribution algorithm that determines the ownership of digital assets. We then normalize the data prior to generating the scores. Moving up yet again, we apply our scoring algorithm to give each company an overall A through F letter grade and individual factor grades. And the factor grades are organized into 10 different focus areas. And our scores are a benchmark of basically how a company is performing relative to its peers. And its peers in this case are similar sized companies. And the SaaS platform, which many of you may have the pleasure of logging into, is a way to display all of this information and organize it for an effective monitoring, reporting, and management of third-party risk. And this slide just gives a sense of some of the scales that we deal with. So, 10 million IPs infected with malware, 80 billion vulnerabilities found every week, 12 million scorecards scored every day, almost 1 million unique followed companies, and thousands of daily users on our platform. And here's another view of how we sort of collect, attribute, analyze the data that our scores are based on. And this study and this partnership with Cyentia is an example of our work in cyber analytics.
Awesome. Thanks for that overview, Greg. Wade, anything to add about the data or what you've seen from Scorecard?
I'll just add that I appreciate the fact that you do this. I mean, there's a lot of security reports out there, and we just couldn't study vulnerability prevalence and the pace of remediation if we just, for instance, did a survey and asked organizations, well, how many vulnerabilities do you have across your external facing assets, and how quickly do you remediate those? It would be almost worthless. So the fact that you collect this and we can actually study that much data from that many organizations over a period of years is amazing. And I hope people value that approach to it, because it's not easy to collect the data or analyze it. So
Yeah, absolutely. I think the hardest part is really attributing and then analyzing, but that is really the value of that outside in view, right? Or what we say is what a hacker sees. And I think what's really interesting, Wade, is Cyentia is always working with other companies who are looking at the internal view. So also thinking about how does this outside view that we get as a security ratings company correlate with what's happening behind a company's firewall.
yep, definitely.
Cool. So moving on, we talked a bit about how we collect the data that went into the report and what went into it. But now let's jump into the meat of it and really go into some of the key findings that we learned and what that means for our audience here. So Wade, I'll turn it over to you, and you want to just let me know when to go to the next slide to go through the findings.
Okay. Let's pull that first one up. All right. So first thing we're looking at here is what proportion of organizations have an internet exposed vulnerability. And Greg has said it several times, and I think I've alluded to it, but keep in mind that we are talking here, the vulnerabilities that we're talking about are detectable on an internet-facing asset, which I think is very interesting and important, because those are kind of the ones that the attackers are probing, right? If they're just looking and scanning the internet for the next target of opportunity, these are the kinds of things that they see and alert their attention that your organization ought to be on their radar for some kind of attack. So, it's over half of organizations have an internet exposed vulnerability. I don't know if that is surprising to you or not. I mean, it's hard to manage any kind of infrastructure, but that is, again, external facing. One of the things I think is important is that when you look, though, at, okay, over half of organizations have a vulnerability, but some of them have a whole lot. That second bar down there, 99% of vulnerabilities are from organizations that have 1,000 or more. So it's kind of, the reason we put that in there is just as a note that vulnerabilities are not spread evenly across all organizations. They don't each get their own fair share. There are a relatively small number of organizations that account for a huge amount of the exposed vulnerabilities on the internet. And of course, from a third-party perspective, maybe it's nice to kind of know who those are and how to deal with them. You might want to treat them differently than an organization that has one or two vulnerabilities. So yeah, let's. I see a question here. After remediation, how does a company get back with Security Scorecard to reassess for improved score? I don't know the answer to that, but maybe Greg or Miriam, you have something to say about that?
Yeah, I can touch that. So there's one of two things that happen. If the customer is not using the platform at all, and they fix something, then when we rescan that asset, we will notice that it's fixed and we will take it off. So there's a natural way of people, without interacting with the platform at all, get things removed. And additionally, if you are a user of our product, even a freemium user, which anyone can become, you can remediate an issue in the platform, and that will trigger it to get rescanned immediately, or at least in a shorter time period than the normal rescan. And so that's a way of getting things off of the scorecard.
Yeah, and the one thing I'll add is that every company has access to their own scorecard for free forever. So you can sign up, you can be accessing your own score, building out a plan to improve it, and then either seeing it improve naturally or letting us know once you've improved it. And then it will be reflected in a scorecard once it's reviewed. But thanks for peppering in the question, Wade. So moving forward with what we have here on your findings, moving to the next slide by sector.
Cool. So this one's interesting. If you take that 53%, obviously that is not for all organizations. That's just kind of the average. And if we look within an industry, we can do the same kind of thing. So within the information services sector there on top, instead of 53% of organizations that have an internet exposed vulnerability, it's nearly 63%. Looking down at the other end of the spectrum in the financial industry, about 49% of financial service firms have an open and exposed vulnerability. And you may be kind of surprised that the variation across those industries is only, 15% or something like that. It's not huge. But keep in mind, this is the overall percentage of organizations, right? Some organizations within those industries still have a ton of vulnerabilities. Some have a little bit. But just in general, you can take two things away from this. There's no industry that's perfect. We all often hold the financial sector as sort of the epitome of good security because they have tons of resources, but almost half of their organizations have internet exposed vulnerabilities. And we could say education. Oh, that's often the opposite end. Everybody picks on them. I work at a college, so I'm familiar with these environments. But they're not that much worse when it comes to organizations that have exposure. So everybody's got something to improve is kind of my takeaway on this slide.
Yeah, I think that's a great takeaway and really interesting to see the breakdown by sector. Then moving forward to actually fixing these vulnerabilities.
There's a lot going on here with the data, and it's just a nice little curve. But again, there's tons and tons of information underlying this. So what we've done here is apply a technique called survival analysis, which is been a statistical method for quite some time now. But anytime you're trying to measure the time to some event, it's a possible way to do this. And we could just say some kind of average, but it would be not very good, and there's a lot of flaws there. So we like to use this survival analysis technique, and we do it really anytime we look at vulnerability remediation in a large enough data set. So what we're measuring is from the time that the vulnerability is first known to be open or exposed, unfixed, till the time that there's another scan and it's confirmed to be closed. How long is that? Obviously, not everything happens just at once. There's a lot of vulnerabilities that take, 25% of them take about 153 days to close. The median time to closure is about a year at 361 days. And then you get, up to multiple years, and that long sort of flattening out of the tail kind of indicates that there's a lot of vulnerabilities that are really never fixed or weren't fixed during the time that we were scanning over this 3-year period. So I am curious in a poll here if this syncs with your assessment of how long it takes to remediate. Remember, we're talking about external facing vulnerabilities. Does it seem long, short, about right? If you want to vote on that, I'm curious. I'm seeing too long seeming to come up here. I don't want to influence the results too much, but it's I was surprised when we saw this about how long it takes. And like I said, we've done this kind of technique with other types of vulnerabilities, and this is, for instance, longer than with some other scenarios we have. And Greg, you and I have talked kind of about why this might be, and how organizations go about remediating these things. I don't know. You have some thoughts on what's going on here?
Yeah. So it's important to keep in mind we're just scanning the entire internet and then attributing it to companies and organizations. So many of these companies and organizations, don't see our results, so they don't necessarily know. They might not have any security apparatus in place, so they might not actually know that they have these vulnerabilities. And two, they might not know how to fix them. And so that sort of just highlights a really big gap, in security. And that's, again, one of the benefits of making our platform available for free for people to monitor themselves is they can actually come in, see these things, realize there's a problem, and then work to fix them.
Yeah, and there's actually a great comment we got from someone in the audience about, it's important to also know the percentage of these vulnerabilities that are being exploited, which would also help companies prioritize that. So we'll jump into that in one moment, but I also think that's a really important factor to look at as well.
Yep.
And Caroline, can we see the poll results? Curious to share what everyone voted for. So not sure if everyone can see the results, but it looks like overwhelmingly 73% of you think that it's too long. No one thinks it's too short, and 27% think that it's about right. So it's about a 70-30 split, and it looks like too long is what we're all thinking, which is what I had in my mind as well. But moving forward here, just real quick before we jump into how it differs among orgs.
Yeah. So what you're looking at here, it takes a lot of space in a report to show that long curve. So for the rest of the time here, we've given this abbreviated version of the survival curve of vulnerability remediation, but it's the same data. There's that 153 days to close 25%. There's the 50% closure at 361 days, and the 537 to get 75%. So the rest of the time, we'll sort of shorten it to this just to make comparisons easier. Same exact information, though. All right, let's do some comparisons.
Let's do it. And thank you, everyone, for participating in the polls. But Greg, you kind of started touching on this, but I want to dig into a little bit more. Why do these rates of management differ among organizations? And what does this tell us about these organizations? So whoever wants to start here.
Yeah, so I can just sort of tee it up a little bit, but one of the things we notice is that the rate of remediation can vary based on a lot of factors. Based on industry, based on sub-industry. It can vary based on organization size, which is sort of a proxy perhaps for whether or not this company has a real security team that looks into these things. And it also varies based on how many findings they have. How big is their backlog that they have to work through. And Wade can go into some of the specifics there, but some of it's really interesting.
Yeah, I think we'll examine some of those things because we had the same question, right? Hey, what's going on here? What makes the difference? What doesn't? And there are some counterintuitive findings here. So, I think let's throw up a few charts, and this is one, for instance. Greg, you mentioned resources may play a role. I mean, we didn't have, what was the size of the security team for all of these organizations, for instance, that we had data on. But what we did have is their overall number of employees. And you can kind of say that, probably those that had more employees had more resources, and the larger you get, the more likely it becomes to have a dedicated team to managing vulnerabilities. And what you see is that seems to kind of pay off, right? In the small 1 to 10 employee organizations, that bar slides off to the right, meaning that it takes longer to hit each of those milestones: 25%, 50%, 75% closure. And for the larger organizations, those milestones are hit more quickly. Again, I think this is probably somewhat intuitive. But then again, you could also argue that those larger organizations have more assets and more vulnerabilities to contend with, and those kinds of things. So,
yeah, absolutely. And if we move forward, let's jump into industries and some of the differences we found there.
It, like the size of the organization, I think there's sort of an implicit way we think certain industries have more or fewer resources than others and may be able to stay on top of vulnerabilities more easily. And this gives you a comparison. I mean, notice just from the top to the bottom, the entertainment sector, surprisingly, is the fastest to remediate vulnerabilities at the midpoint, 215 days. And notice healthcare down at the bottom is the slowest to reach that midpoint at 486 days. Now, that's over twice as long to reach the halfway point in vulnerability remediation. So we're not talking about just a couple days difference or minor differences here among some of these industries. We're talking about twice as long in some cases. So I find that pretty interesting. Now, it begs the question of what's going on. We hypothesize in the report, the extent to which each of these industries has external facing assets and the use and function of those assets will have a lot to do with what you see here. I'm not sure that the entertainment sector is necessarily has the strongest security posture, right? I think they may have maybe a more condensed set of internet-facing assets, or maybe they're more informational and those kinds of things. So a lot going on here that we could unpack probably for days. I'll just call out one more finding that surprised me, and then Greg, I'm interested to hear your thoughts. But notice the financial sector and where it sits. Again, we're so used to seeing finance as whatever the best end of the spectrum is, and they're in the bottom three among the three slowest sectors for remediating vulnerabilities, which to me was kind of a shock.
Yeah, and so my takeaway also, and I think we're going to this a little bit in the next slide, is even within an industry there can be more differentiation within that industry than there is from one industry to another industry based on subsectors or sub areas. And so it is very interesting to see this as a general trend, but I wouldn't run away from this and say okay, this industry is great versus this industry is terrible. Don't forget, each of these industries is made up of thousands and thousands of companies. And so there could be very good examples within an industry and very bad examples within that industry as well.
Yep. And let's show that, I believe, on the next slide. And then there's a couple questions that are probably good to get to. But that notion that, okay, all organizations are not alike. We see some differences among industries, but even within one industry, there's a huge variation among different types of organizations. And I think that is shown quite clearly here when we break down the finance industry into its subsectors. So that credit intermediation and related activities, I think, is a fancy way of saying banks, consumer banks. And then on the bottom, for instance, you have insurance carriers, both considered financial services, but very, very, very different timeframes for remediation. Banks are twice as fast as the insurance carriers to remediate their external facing vulnerabilities. And just keep this in mind anytime you look at industry aggregate statistics, right? Each of these has a different business model, different kind of way that they have assets, different regulatory pressures, all of those things, which really do shape the way that they detect and mitigate security vulnerabilities.
And in this case, they have different assets at risk as well.
True.
Yeah, and moving forward, we can also look at the utility subsectors.
Yeah, this one is super interesting because I was very glad to see that the nuclear power generation was the fastest to remediate vulnerabilities. If I had to pick one, that would be it. I'm sure it's bad news if wind power generation facilities are compromised. But again, if I had to pick one, I'm gonna go with nuclear, that I'd like to see doing the best. But major differences, threefold, almost fourfold span between the fastest and the slowest in just breaking down the utility into its subsectors.
Yeah, and before we continue, I'm actually going to put up another audience poll before we get to our next topic. But again, the audience poll is up, so do you measure the percentage of vulnerabilities that your organization fixes in a given time period?
I will, while you're doing that, I'll say that there's a comment that from someone who's worked in the nuclear sector, tend to have the lowest number of exposed assets. And I should have mentioned that. I think we may mention that in the report, and that has a lot to do with it, honestly. If you have industries or subsectors that tend to have fewer internet exposed assets, are going to have fewer vulnerabilities to contend with, and therefore it takes less time to fix a couple than it does a couple thousand. So those kinds of things definitely play into what you see.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point that you touched on when we were looking at the industry comparison in the beginning. But just the importance of, okay, we have this comparison of who we've, quote, ranked as remediating the fastest or the slowest, but there's really so many nuances within each one, which is what's really interesting about these reports and even breaking it down even further.
Yep.
Yeah, so if we can pull up the poll results, curious to see what we got from the audience. But what we're seeing is that 68% of you, so an overwhelming majority of you, are measuring the percentage of vulnerabilities that your org fixes. And I would imagine that this is also going into board reporting, especially as executive level C-suites and boards are starting to look at security more. I'd also be really curious to see the industry breakdown here, which we obviously can't. But then 16% of you said no, and then 16% of you said no, but you would like more information. So about 70, kind of similar to before. But thanks for participating. This is really interesting information as we drive the discussion, which does bring us to our next question and next discussion with Wade and Greg, which is about an organization's capacity to remediate vulnerabilities.
All right, this is I think super interesting, and so we talked about the prevalence, we talked about the speed of remediation, but what we want to get at here is kind of what is the net outcome of all of this remediation activity? Are organizations driving down the number of open vulnerabilities in their environment over time, or are those piling up, right? And we've sometimes referred to this as security debt, and the more things sit out there, it's not just a static surface, right? There's new assets, those assets, new vulnerabilities become known on those assets, patches are being deployed, so it's always fluctuating, but this just nets it out to a simple ratio. And so let's look at the chart on the left. Every purple dot is an organization among those 1.6 million, I believe, that we measured. And across the x-axis at the bottom is the number of vulnerabilities that we observed across their internet-facing infrastructure. Okay, so there's some vulnerabilities with 100, some vulnerabilities with 100 million. And then on the y-axis, we're measuring the average number of vulnerabilities that are closed in a given month across that environment. Again, there's a wide span there. But it's the combination of these two that I find super interesting. And I mean, it's amazing how tight those organizations are around that yellow line, which kind of is a 1 to 10 to 1 ratio. So if you have 1,000 vulnerabilities in your environment, you close about 100 in any given month. If you have 10 million vulnerabilities in your environment, you're closing about 1 million. Super tight relationship there. And, that 10% is kind of, I don't know, kind of low, maybe surprisingly low, right? And it introduces this notion of capacity. There's a limit, a ceiling to the proportion of vulnerabilities that a typical organization can possibly close within any given time frame. And the chart on the right shows that fluctuates a little bit. The interquartile range, the middle 50% of organizations fall between 7.7% and 12.7%. And there's a few that go beyond those extremes. but that's where most people are, in those kind of lower percentages of the vulnerabilities that they're able to close. And of course, I think this introduces the topic of, well, if you're constrained, if your capacity is limited to remediate vulnerabilities, then that means you really need to focus on the ones that actually matter. And I've seen several comments as we've gone along here about, it's critical to know about exploited vulnerabilities. Knowing the underlying asset value is important. And that's exactly right. Those are the kinds of things. If we can't fix everything, we need to fix what really matters. And that is my ultimate takeaway from this particular chart is we have finite capacity to fix what really matters. So it's ultra important. I don't know, Greg, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely anytime you have any sort of limited capacity, it's important to make sure that you prioritize correctly. Just sort of lingering on this plot a little bit, when I first saw this to me just screamed out. My background is in physics prior to going to data science and technology and cybersecurity. And like this to me just screams out like there's a very clear model going on here. And it was remarkable to see the tightness. Very rarely do we see stuff in our data sets that are so clearly, correlated and constrained. Because again, this is just human and organizational behavior, right? There's no underlying mechanism, a priori that we'd expect this to happen. And so just to have a result like this appear is really remarkable and really emphasizes that I think a lot of people are under very similar constraints in basically in the out in the world.
Yeah, and I think that hits the nail on the head that remediation capacity is a problem for everyone. And we've had some comments in the chat about differences in different industries, some that might have personnel shortages, that have more regulatory compliance that they have to abide to. So it is really interesting to see this pattern here that you all found. But with that, we did launch a poll, and I'll just switch real quick, and this will lead us into the topic that I know a lot of you have been chatting about in the chat, is how do you prioritize, or should we really be looking at exploitable vulnerabilities? So poll's been up for a little bit, but question here is, does your organization prioritize known exploited vulnerabilities? And I think everyone's had time to answer it. So if we can put up this, the results here, what we're seeing is that 94% of you said, yes, you are prioritizing exploited vulnerabilities. 6% said no, but you plan to. It's really interesting and not surprising, but also curious. I would be curious to understand, for those of you who aren't able to do it yet, kind of what's holding back or what are the plans to do so. Greg, Wade, any takeaways from these results?
I'm glad to see it because we've done a lot of research on this, and it's one of the best ways to focus your remediation efforts, along with other things like knowing which assets are more critical and where your sensitive data is, all of those kinds of things. But the ones that attackers have an easy way to exploit are generally the ones that are picked on and sought after, and behind, breaches and other bad outcomes that we want to avoid.
Yeah, absolutely. And now with this in mind, let's look at what you found in the research.
Yeah, was kind of disappointed, let down about this. The net of it is we didn't really see evidence that organizations on a wide scale are prioritizing the remediation of vulnerabilities with known exploit code. There, I think, could be several explanations for this, because we've seen in other data sets that there is more of a difference for known exploit code. One here, I think, and Greg, Miriam, correct me if I'm wrong here or misstating this, but unless an organization is a security scorecard customer, you're not reaching out to them and telling them that, hey, this vulnerability is, if they log into their portal, they'll see that, oh, I have these vulnerabilities, but it's not like a alert is going off in their SOC. or they're being notified to, hey, you need to fix this on a regular basis or anything like that. And so, maybe there's a lot of organizations that don't know that they're out there and need fixing. And then therefore they're not really prioritizing at all. So I don't know. other perspectives on that?
Yeah, I think it's similar to the point we made earlier in terms of how long it takes to remediate things, where many of the companies we're scoring and we have data on aren't necessarily ingesting this data either from us or from anywhere else, right? Like they might not even have an internal security program. And so some of these, like for those types of companies, it wouldn't surprise me if it's like a random walk, right? They just sort of randomly stumble upon fixing things when they have to upgrade to get some new functionality. They might not even be intentionally upgrading for security. And so, I suspect there's a lot of that going on.
Yeah, and just to add to that and what you were saying, Wade, that is correct. We're not proactively reaching out to companies and telling them we're finding these vulnerabilities. But sometimes what does happen, and we'll kind of jump into this in a little bit, is we'll have companies reach out to their third parties or some of their critical vendors and let them know. So there's a really collaborative workflow that we see happen with our customers who are using us for third-party risk management. And that's an interesting way to help companies prioritize it and let them know, hey, this is there and we'll help you fix it.
Yeah, and one other final point I just wanted to make is, the juxtaposition of this finding with the poll that we conducted earlier is a very good example of sample bias. People who are willing to spend an hour of their time hearing about remediating vulnerabilities are probably the types of people that sort of know what a high severity versus a low severity CV is and how to build a system to prioritize those and make sure those get fixed faster.
Yeah, that's a great point, Greg. And I mean, thank you all for being here and also for making sure you're fixing your organization's vulnerabilities. I'm just going to move on to the next slide on this topic here.
All right. Yeah, I think this is sort of the culmination of findings in the report, and it picks up where we left off, right? If we can measure the capacity of organizations, that's sort of overall. This chart takes that and just asks the simple question, when we look at the average number of or vulnerabilities that are open across the external infrastructure, is that number trending up or trending down? And you can view this as it's labeled in the chart sort of as change in the attack surface, right? Are you broadening your attack surface or are you shrinking it? And I was glad to see that 60% of organizations are actually driving down open vulnerabilities across their environment or shrinking their attack surface. Because from the other stats, the fact that it takes a while to remediate vulnerabilities, that there's sort of this 10% average capacity, you might get the sense that just everybody's doing terrible and the world is ending and all of that kind of stuff. But I think this is a ray of sunshine in the sense that if you're able to focus on vulnerabilities that matter, you can leverage that limited capacity to do a lot of good and actually reduce risk in your environment. And there's a lot of organizations that are actually doing that. Yes, there's still open vulnerabilities. They still have work to do, but at least they're not piling them up and getting worse over time. Well, 4 in 10 are doing that. But 6 out of 10 are driving them down. I think that's important to latch on, not only for your organization, are you measuring something like this, but also what about other organizations that you're working with? Are they trending up, trending down? Might make a difference on how you manage them and partner with them and secure those external relationships as well.
Absolutely. Greg, anything to add here?
I just thought this was, again, like super interesting. Like this and the previous slide are by far my two favorite findings. This is some of the sort of, at Security Scorecard, we have a ton of data. And this is, to me, how do you convert data to knowledge and knowledge to wisdom? And this is sort of going along that path, right? So instead of just saying, okay, we find all of this data, now we can sort of tell more and more comprehensive stories about what is going on with a specific vendor. Are they the type of vendor that's constantly driving down? Are they the type of vendor that's constantly submerged? Do they have more capacity than average or less capacity than average? And so this is just really interesting findings. Like I said, really happy to work with Wade and happy with this partnership in this report.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is what I love about working with the Cyentia Institute, is being able to tell these stories through the data. But so Wade and Greg, I mean, you both alluded to, I guess we have another poll. Forgot to launch here. But the first one is about how, sorry about that, how do you have a backup for at-risk symptoms? And then the other one is about how vulnerabilities give you insight into third-party risk. But I do really want to touch on this topic with our panel in just a second, specifically the one on third-party risk that we've already talked about a little bit, right? So how do you select vendors that hopefully are trending towards bringing down vulnerabilities? If you're comparing them, how can you do that? But also another angle to think about is, you all work at different companies, organizations, and your goals are also tied to your company's revenue goals and getting customers. So also, if your organization is one that's really in that top quadrant of being able to drive down vulnerabilities, how can you also use that to your advantage to get more business? And there's kind of two sides to everything. But before we jump into that, Carolyn, if you want to bring up the poll results from here. Cool. So looking at this, 89% of you have a backup for at-risk systems, which is great. 11% of you don't yet, but you plan to. So it's also promising in planning to have that up and running. Greg, Wade, any comment here on this poll?
I mean, that's encouraging. One of the things when evaluating customers or potential third parties, with this data and with Security Scorecard is to understand, like, okay, is working with this company a direct cyber risk to me? Like, am I inheriting transferable cyber risk? But there's also the business risk, right? So like, even if there isn't transferable cyber risk, there's very likely going to be transferable business risk. So if you're like an e-commerce store, right, and you're working with an online payment processor, and that's your only online payment processor, and they're like super susceptible to getting ransomware or malware or have other sorts of attacks against them, and you don't have a backup for that, that's going to directly affect your company's top line. And so it's very important to sort of use, one way of using Security Scorecard is not just to monitor and manage your third-party risk, but also help choose areas where you might need, maybe two payment service providers, or choose areas where you want to, in the bake-off or in choosing a vendor, you want to pick one who's demonstrably better in security.
Yeah, absolutely. And, also just looking at some of the poll answers in here, what some of you answered for how vulnerabilities are giving you insight into third-party risk. And majority of you said it lets you know if you want to do business with that vendor in the first place and informs on what risk they're placing your company at. So that's exactly about what Greg is talking about, knowing who you're working with and what risk they pose and also how you can mitigate it. Wade, any comment on the poll results?
On those, I tend to think of this, and I think we have a slide next that kind of depicts it, actually, if you wouldn't mind pulling that up. In studying the data, it's kind of how I think about it. All right, if you have vulnerabilities in your external facing assets, well, you're not just doing business with yourself. There's lots of they have the same thing. So as you join these all together, it just becomes more and more and more potential exposures, and figuring out how to manage that is not easy. I mean, but it definitely introduces a lot in that third-party risk management sphere that I think organizations ought to give a lot more thought to, honestly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think especially with pandemic and the transition to remote work that most companies have gone through over the past 2.5 years almost now, we have seen an exponential growth in the number of vendors that organizations are working with. So this is really key. We love to think of it as like a building almost, that if you live in a building, your security can be great and you can have an alarm system and your windows can be sealed and locked. But as soon as one person breaks one of the windows of your neighbors or gets in, then the whole building you live in is compromised. And it's kind of the same thing with your third parties. If your security is up to date and great, that's awesome. But then if your payment vendor, for example, goes down, then that's going to compromise you as well. So that's kind of another way to think of this visualization. But just moving forward real quick, and Greg, want to pass it to you just to chat a little bit about how at Security Scorecard we help organizations both protect these third and fourth parties and then also work with them.
Sure thing. Yeah, so this is a screenshot from our AVD product, which stands for Automatic Vendor Detection, where we go out and basically scan the internet, look for links that connect two companies together. So that would denote them like company A as a third party of company B. And we sort of spider this graph out, right? So we can have fourth parties and fifth parties and so on and so forth. And so that's where we get this nth party ecosystem. We're able to calculate an nth party risk score from this. And we're also able to sort of help people identify what companies are either disproportionately weighted heavily in this. So, for instance, you yourself might not be using AWS, but you might have 6 vendors that are. And now all of a sudden you have some exposure to AWS. For instance, if AWS goes down, then all of those 6 vendors go down. What's the impact to you? And so this is sort of how this spiders out. And it's a really interesting, fairly new product that we have.
Yeah, and I love this visualization, specifically the ability to create this supply chain risk score and actually, we kind of chatted about board reporting earlier, but then being able to go out to your board and tell them, hey, we're doing great, here's our grade. But if we consider all of our third and fourth parties, this is what we're looking at. And then just moving forward real quick to, we talked about, and there was that great question about if we're alerting vendors. And I mentioned we're not, but we help companies invite their vendors. So Greg, if you want to chat about how we're helping companies collaborate to just create a better secure ecosystem.
Yeah. So, our products emphasize that security is a team sport. So we make it easy for companies to invite their vendors into Security Scorecard. They can get access to freemium, which is, again, 100% free. They can see everything that we see about them and work to make themselves more secure. Either the company inviting their third party or the third party themselves can work to create a remediation plan, which basically helps them get from one grade to a higher grade that they pick as a target. And we want people to work to reduce risk together. And I don't think we have a slide on it here, but there is demonstrable, like we've done other analyses that show that invited vendors on average have higher security posture than the companies that are just sort of generically in our platform. And you can see the change basically from being invited to working on reducing and remediating their issues and becoming more secure. And so that's really what this is all about. It's all about making sure that you're secure, making sure your third parties are secure, and finding a way to easily monitor, generate alerts, help work with your vendors, work with your third parties to make them more secure.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Thank you, Greg. And just one other thing I want to point out here, which really actually connects to what we were talking about earlier about the importance of prioritization. That's also the great thing about kind of this center image over here about being able to create a path to remediation is actually being able to work either for your own company or for your vendors and tell them, all right, we want to get you from a C to a B, but here are the highest impact things and the most important vulnerabilities that you should work on that will help get you there. So that does touch on a lot of the questions that everyone had about how organizations are prioritizing remediation. Wade, anything else to add on third parties? You're muted. It's not a Zoom webinar. No,
Sorry. Right. It was me. Sorry. Give me the red card. I'll just add that if there are any questions that you have in terms of managing security and risk across third parties that you think Security Scorecard's data might be able to answer, let us know, because we're actively pursuing additional research avenues beyond this Fast and Frivolous report. We're going to extend that beyond just vulnerabilities. So there's more to come and plenty of challenges. So if you have a favorite or something you really want to know, let us know.
Yeah, that's a great also segue to our next report that's coming out. And this little topic of third and fourth party risk is a small teaser, so I'll leave it there. But moving forward, just one thing I want to comment on that I see in the chat is about Security Scorecard being valuable for mergers and acquisitions, and that's absolutely true. That's also one of our big use cases that we see customers doing. Is part of your due diligence process is not just the financial due diligence, but cyber due diligence has to be an important piece of that. So we are definitely a data point that is really valuable for that. But with that, we are towards the end, and wow, I can't believe the hour went by so quickly. But I do always love to end with a tip for the audience. So whoever wants to go first, but if you want to share a recent book, podcast, article, or even something you follow and can be security related, can just be something you find interesting with our audience.
I will go for an absolutely shameless plug of checking out other Cyentia research. I mean, we seriously love doing data-driven reports like this, and there's a ton of them on our website at cyentia.com/research. You can read all kinds of things like this. I know that's shameless, but I did it.
No problem. It is interesting, so I think we all appreciate the tip. How about you, Greg?
Just as a general tip, I'd say just stay curious. There's a lot of things to learn out there, a lot of things that you can work to be better. Just stay curious. In terms of like book, podcast, stuff like that, in the cyber realm, I'm currently reading Big Breaches, which is pretty interesting. Covers a lot of the really big breaches from the last few years in a lot of detail. I really like how they sort of lay stuff out. I remember reading blog posts and news articles at the time, but those often repeated the same thing over and over again, and this sort of has a much more rich, detailed narrative, so that's really cool. And then, I could go on and on about other books that I'm reading or have read, but I won't because they're not relevant to cybersecurity.
Awesome, thanks, Greg. And you said it's called Big Breaches?
Yes.
Cool, I will have to add it to my list, but that sounds fascinating. And then before we go, we have time for one question, and there was one that came in that I wanted to address. So, Greg, this is more on the scorecard side, but someone is asking if you can share a bit more about how these vulnerabilities are being detected. So is it through CPE matching? Is there active testing of them? If you can provide a bit more context on how we do that.
Yeah, I will do my best. This is more of an area for our threat intel and signal collection to go into sort of more the nitty-gritty details. What I will say is everything is outside facing in and non-intrusive. So we're not doing anything to get into a network. We're just basically looking at what exists for headers, basically what services are being shown in port scans and sort of slightly deeper scans. And so that's my understanding of it. I apologize if I couldn't be a little bit more detailed, but I do believe we have some better collateral on that we can pull up.
Yeah, we actually have a lot of information about that, and I'll just share the link to what's our trust portal on the site that provides information. I guess I can't share with everyone here, but it's just trust.securityscorecard.com. And you can see everything there from our white paper about how we collect our data and really where it all comes from to real-time stats on how many companies we're rating, how, what the accuracy is and how many issues we're discovering and so much more. But with that, we are at the top of the hour. So thank you all so much for joining. This has been really fun. Thank you, Wade. Thank you, Greg. I loved chatting with you and going over the report more. I'm really excited for our future reports. But before we end, just kind of quick plug to visit the Cyentia Institute, check out more of their research because it is really fascinating and they're partnering with some of the leading cybersecurity companies to get this type of data. And similarly, as I mentioned, Security Scorecard is available for free for any company forever. So you can create your free account at securityscorecard.com/free-account. But with that, we'll wrap it up. So thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the week.
Thanks.